I'm now going to hand over to the evil genius. No, not the evil genius, the beneficent and wonderful genius that is Iain Corby, who is masterminding this whole event and is a key individual in the Age Verification Providers Association's project. Iain.
Thank you very much, John, and welcome to everybody, particularly those of you who've put your nostrils and tonsils through all the tests that are required in order to turn up here in Athens, but also to our 200 or so online participants. It's great to be in Athens. I got up bright and early yesterday to visit the Acropolis, and I noticed perhaps the inspiration for one of the online attendees I noticed was joining us today, Lego. It does appear that Lego was invented sometime BC, as you can see from this shot I took yesterday of the Acropolis. But we're so excited to have seen such a high level of interest in this project, not just by the companies you see here, which we believe are either in the room or online, but also from what we understand from the Commission, which frankly for them is a fairly small project financially, to know that it has absolutely had totally disproportionate levels of interest from stakeholders as they've been setting things up. I'm going to try to set the scene today, and I apologise for those of you who are deep experts in age verification and parental consent, but I do think we ought to assume nothing for some of our participants, so I will just do a 5-minute sort of starter for 10, as it were, on what we're trying to achieve here. This is a fairly famous cartoon. We see one dog here using the internet and telling the puppy next to him, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And the problem that we're dealing with is that on the internet, nobody knows that you are a child. So what we are trying to do is nothing more and nothing less than to implement in the online world the same rules and norms that we already apply in the real world and have applied for, decades. So whether that's buying age-restricted goods, accessing services, gambling's been mentioned, content, and obviously adult content will be a key focus, but also just in general, it's very hard for a child to sign a contract and for them to be held by that contract in all circumstances. There are some circumstances where it does work, but generally it doesn't. Or to share your personal data, and this is where parental consent comes in, because if you are under the age of digital consent, which is between 13 and 16 in different member states, you do need your parents' consent in order for you to give permission for others to process your data. I would say this is probably the most little-known aspect of GDPR that I've come across. And increasingly now, we're moving beyond those sort of legal hard and fast rules to softer rules around exposure to harmful content, such as explanations around self-harm or information on eating disorders, which could cause teenage kids to get into serious physical harm by virtue of what they find on the internet. June actually mentioned the two key pieces of law at the European level that we are focused on facilitating the implementation of. But there are also a wide number of member state initiatives. We've seen these in Germany and in France. We also, perhaps in the UK, pushing ahead a little faster than others around the rights of children online to have age-appropriate design, not only in terms of adults versus children, but actually then trying to look at different age ranges of children below 18. And our colleagues in Ireland have a similar initiative with their document around the fundamentals for a child-oriented approach to data processing. So what is the challenge when it comes to online age verification? One thing we are very keen to repeat is that the essence of age verification is the ability to prove your age online without disclosing your full identity. And I think this is even more important when we come to children, because the last thing we want to do is to be encouraging children to share personal information on the internet. We always tell the story of walking into a bar and the landlord doesn't need to know your name, he just needs to know if you're old enough to buy beer. And that's what we're trying to replicate online. But there are some issues with that. Obviously, we don't want to create a lot of bumpiness in the user experience of working online. So we want to be able to recognize people who've already proven their age. And ideally, we don't want people to have to prove their age over and over again with multiple different websites or the age verification providers that they use. We want to try and do that in a very cost-effective way. It shouldn't become an enormous expense to services on the internet. It's just something that's going to happen in the background. And we need to do it proportionately. So some of these laws are very hard and fast and very important that you need to be exactly 18 years old, not 17 years and 364 days if you're going to buy something dangerous like a knife online. But for other situations, a more proportional approach where an estimate of age, give or take 1 or 2 years, is going to be more than sufficient. So we're looking at coming up with a European-wide solution that deals with that range of challenges. And I don't want to preempt what my colleagues Costas and Tony are going to talk about in the second half of today's conference. But just to give you a rough idea, what we're looking at is how do we create an open, competitive market which any certified age verification provider or parental consent facilitator or organizations which can do both are able to do that work and then to share those certifications, or attributes is the word you'll hear us use, with each other, and to trust one another. Those have been conducted to the same level of confidence. The term we use for that is level of assurance, so that each knows that they can rely on other people working in that network. And initially that will be through different providers creating bilateral arrangements and perhaps paying one another some commission. None of that is for this project. We are about the nuts and bolts of how do they talk to one another and how do they trust one another. Just to give you a view of our timeline, we began in March, and I suppose rather unusually when you're pitching for a project, we didn't actually have a ready-made solution. So our proposal to the Commission was, say, we wanted to really build our solution on the views of children, parents, and wider adults across Europe. So we've been in a very intense period of research, both academic and empirical research, to understand what is out there, what's available today, which was an area that my organisation, the Age Verification Providers Association, led on, but also to understand some of the academic background and to get some fresh research with children to ask what they and their parents would be willing to do and what they think about age verification. So we'll be having, as June mentioned, a pilot. The large pilot will be in May of next year, and we have quite an aggressive timeline to open up the network so that those who weren't part of the pilot can become certified and join from next summer. So the research that you're going to hear from after me will come from my colleagues at Aston University, Leiden University, the excellent researchers at Revealing Reality, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. So that's what you have to follow. Just very briefly on our own work, the AVPA is the trade association for about 22 at the moment, providers of age verification and age estimation. Just a little word on terminology. You may hear age assurance used. We tend to use that as a catch-all for all forms, all methods of age checking, with age verification being the harder, more specific measure, and age estimation being the sort of artificial intelligence-led methods for figuring out the likely age of somebody online. These are my fantastic members, and many of those specialize in one or other, and some do both of those techniques. Some of them are more focused in proving your age in the real world, perhaps using a smartphone, at the moment it's very hard to prove your identity with your phone. That's another problem we'll be tackling in this project. So how do we do age checks? Well, some of you may have had to produce a passport or an identity card. Send an image of that online. We can do different levels of check on that, right the way up to reading a chip to make sure the image in the chip is the same as a selfie that you then take, or you may even say a few words in order to prove you are the same person. We could check against data sets like the electoral roll. In the UK, mobile phone accounts are split between adults and children, but sadly that's not available across the whole of the EU. And then we move to the sort of biometrics, where probably the most advanced of those is facial estimation, where taking a snapshot and just looking at somebody's face instantaneously can give an estimate based on looking at a lot of other faces in the past and knowing the ages of those faces. The computer can figure out within, say, plus or minus 2 years, and that's getting better all the time. But also things like how we type, the language we use, and voice print analysis, which I hope would guess me to be 21, young and dynamic, rather than the 48 that I actually am. And finally, another area is social proofing, and perhaps this is something that some of the social media platforms are already looking at. So having a look at your claimed age, and then the actual age of the people you hang out with and talk to online, or where you have said you go to school. A lot of other factors can be taken into account. Just finally, on the work that we did as our part of this work package at the beginning of the project, we've been looking for what's out there already in terms of practical age verification around Europe. Sadly, we found little or no age verification in the majority of member states across goods, content and services. Quite often self-declaration is used. This is where you're asked to type in your date of birth or your age. This really doesn't pass go in terms of being age verification, so we have somewhat discounted that. So why is it that people aren't doing it? Well, perhaps it's because there is a lack of common standards and terminology. Perhaps it's because that even when businesses want to be compliant, the complexity of doing that across multiple jurisdictions is just too intimidating. And then the thing we hear most often is nobody wants to be first, because there's a concern that if you put up that barrier of asking people for their age and you're the only site doing it, then people may go to other sites. So it's very important that we help facilitate a level playing field, so everybody has access to the same techniques for age checks, and then everybody can apply them from day one across the board. Obviously, a multinational age verification framework will facilitate that with interoperability, which I described earlier. And also, we found very little evidence, in fact, I would say no evidence of people applying the digital age of consent, so seeking that parental consent when they're trying to get children to share their data. So that is our conclusion from the AVPA, and John, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Iain. They've done an amazing job in, as Iain said, a very, relatively speaking, a very, very short space of time. We're now moving